Hello, my name is Amy Wood, and I'm the Executive Director of the Raymond A. Wood Foundation. And we're talking today with Cheryl Theis on the topic of, especially with school starting back up, we're entering into the new 2023-2024 school year. And many of us are just getting into the daunting task of getting ready for the new school year. Maybe our children are transitioning to new schools and we're meeting new IEP teams. And maybe our children have just been recently diagnosed. And so all of the school accommodations is something new and uncharted territory. So we're happy to have Cheryl here with us today to answer some questions. So we'll start, Cheryl, just to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the good work you guys do. It's so important. So I work here at the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. We're known as DREDF, and we're a national law and policy center. And we're really committed to supporting cross disability, no matter what the issues are, people with disabilities. I work in what's called the Parent Training and Information Center, and we help parents and caregivers and youth themselves as they get older, and any community providers too, understand how to navigate the complex world of special needs, disability support, and so on. And so I've been at DREDF for about 15, almost 16 years. I have 5 kids. 2 of them are adopted out of foster care, and 2 of my kids have needed special education support. And one thing that I've learned along the way is that, it is so overwhelming and confusing already when you're just trying to parent a child. And then I tell people, welcome to special education or disability support because you have a new part-time job. So that's really where we're coming from, is information is power. We want you to know how to navigate the system and really just what are the resources for help too. So we can talk about that today. I'm looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. We're so happy to have you here. So for many of our families, the diagnosis of a brain tumor may come or does come as a surprise, and many of the children are maybe leading normal lives up until that diagnosis. And then with treatment, there may come some need for special services in school. So maybe just starting at a high level, what should families and parents start thinking about if this becomes one of the things that they have to tackle post-diagnosis?
Right. So I always start by telling parents, you're the expert on your own child. You hold that medical history, you hold how they were doing before they were diagnosed, before surgery, before treatment. You are the expert. And so one of the most important things you can do is use that, leverage that to say, this is who my child was before, this is what's happening now. Because everything we're going to talk about today is really built on this idea that you build a plan for a child to be able to access their education or benefit from their education based on evaluation and data. But there's medical information, educational information, personal information. Every family's different, every child's different. There's cultural differences. So I think that's job one. The second is that sometimes you will push up against what I think of as kind of misplaced optimism with the schools. In other words, they'll say things like, well, let's just give it some time. And when it comes to the stuff we're talking about, time really matters. And intervention really matters. So if that little voice inside your head is saying, I think that more support is needed, or I think we at least need more information, start the process. And we'll talk about what that process is. Don't wait. And the other piece is that you also are really the broker between the healthcare system, which has its own challenges, and the school system. And it's really complicated sometimes to know, how much do I share? How much do I not share? And so on. So the other thing I would say is find out where your help is. Obviously, your foundation is one important source of help. Every single state has a parent training and information center where parents can get free help about how to help a child who might be struggling in school related to a disability or a possible disability, and go from there.
Thank you. So let's kind of start with the basics. The first big question we get is, what is a 504? What is an IEP? Can you explain that?
Yes, and there's so much misunderstanding about this. And in fact, I often find that even educators in schools don't understand really some of this. So in the most basic terms, 504 is part of the anti-discrimination laws in the United States. And it says that, no one, whether it's in employment or school or any other thing, if you're involved in any organization or institution or activity that takes federal or public money in any way, you can't discriminate, not on the basis of race, not on the basis of religion, and for 504 specifically, not on the basis of disability. And there's a lot of overlap between 504 and the Americans with Disability Act. We don't need to get into that, but just understand that they're sort of complementary. And what a 504 plan does is it says, we don't need to necessarily provide this child or the student with an individualized school program or pull them out for services, but we absolutely need to level the playing field. If this child can't access education like everybody else because of a disability or a suspected disability, then we need to figure out what accommodations and supports we can provide. It's a civil rights law. It's not an education law. And there's a lot of confusion about whether you need a medical diagnosis or not. Probably not so much of an issue for the people that you're serving, that we're talking to today, but you aren't required to have a medical diagnosis. If there's a concern, then it's the school's obligation to do an evaluation to see if the child is eligible for support. So there's some common accommodations like extra time to do things, homework, in-class assignments, using assistive technology like the computer, voice to text, things like that. But the other big misconception, in addition to you do not have to have a medical diagnosis, but a lot of schools think you do, is that you can access some special education support, things like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language therapy, even with a 504 plan. It's just that the standard is a little bit different. And this is so confusing for families. I remember with my own son, it was super confusing. So the test for 504 is, what do we need to do so this child can access their education? We tell people, think about it like the wheelchair ramp law. If your child can't get into the building because there's no ramp, it doesn't matter that they could be fine once they were there. They have no access. So 504 is all about providing a child with access. That can also include things like consultation to the teacher, helping the teachers, and other people at the school understand the child's needs. But if the child needs special education support in order to have equal access, so for example, if they have occupational therapy to help them with some of their fine motor or sensory overwhelm, they're more able to participate and engage in the regular classroom, then that's something that you can ask about. Just remember that 504 is a general education intervention. It's not special education. It's a law that is intended to help schools create a plan with the help of parents, hopefully, that will provide that child with equal access to education. So the standard is, what does this child need in order to access their education, similar to kids who aren't struggling with a special healthcare need or a disability? An IEP, on the other hand, is a federal education law. So remember, I said 504 is a anti-discrimination civil rights law. And special education comes under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. See how many acronyms there are. And it's a federal law that applies to every state and territory. And it says that if you want any public funding, you have to have a program where you make sure that all students can access education and benefit from it. And if that requires that their education be individualized, there's a special term they often use called specially designed instruction, whether it's around mental health, physical health, learning disability, whatever the issues are, if the child needs more individualized help in order to meet their own goals that the team, school team and the parent work on together, then they get what's called an IEP, which just stands for Individualized Education Program. And just by the way, we will share the links to a lot of these definitions and so on. So please, if you're listening to this, don't feel like you have to know it right out of the chutes. But the most important thing I want you all to take away is that every child who has an IEP, in other words, they're eligible for special education, is already protected by 504. They're not, you don't write a 504 plan and an IEP. In an IEP plan, there will be a section around accommodations. And that's really sort of where the 504 part of all this is living. So, it's not like it's okay to discriminate against students with disabilities if they have an IEP. They still are protected by all the other laws. But if you think about all the children in a classroom, some of them may need some 504 support. Some of that group may also need some individualized support, so that little inner circle of students gets the most protection and help. The only other thing I'd say about the difference between the two plans is that, or the two programs, is that special education is, there are 13 different qualifying categories. They're not medical diagnoses, they're educational categories. So if a child has a learning disability because of side effects from chemo or because they were born with dyslexia, it's irrelevant. The point is, do they qualify under one of these big umbrella educational categories? And if they do, how do we provide an individualized education program for them so that they can get ready for future education, employment, and independent living? And it's comes with a whole bunch of rights for parents. And 504 is really, that's not the focus, and a lot of the timelines and the rules are much more wiggly with 504. Doesn't mean it can't be a wonderful way to support a child, but it's just important for people to know that the strongest protections for your input, you become a member of an IEP team. You are part of the decision-making process, and 504 is really more of the school's process. That was a long answer.
No,
sorry.
I think we needed that detail, so I appreciate that. So let's talk IEP meetings. Those, for parents maybe that have never been to one but have one in their future, or for those of us who are used to the process, they can be really intimidating because you're sitting at a table with a lot of people. So it's kind of like you and them, right? So what is your advice for best preparing for an IEP meeting, whether it's your first or your 15th? How often should there be an IEP meeting held? Would love your input, insights there.
Yeah, those are all great questions. And, I've been doing this work for a really long time, but I still have been known to break down in my own child's IEP meeting, because you're discussing often, what's hard for them, or you're getting feedback about like ways in which they're different, or, problems that the teacher may be having, knowing how to support them, or even understanding where they're coming from, and so on. And so I think we also live in a world where there's this tendency to always think, well, it must be a family problem, or, don't you think you should take care of that with healthcare team? Maybe there's a medication for that sort of thing. And that's not at all what this law intends. So preparing for the meeting is really important. And again, we will provide some resources, including a little checklist about how to prepare. But first of all, you want to make sure you have all of the information you need. So it's a really good idea to request all your child's records, just so that you can see. For example, they might be saying your child doesn't qualify for services because, that they're doing okay academically, but when you can show that they were, earning A's, and then they've had to surgery and chemo and so on, and now there's, been a significant impact and they're really struggling with a lot of support to pass, then, that's information the team needs to know. So getting your child's records is important. Secondly, we just tell families, don't go to an IEP meeting alone. If you can possibly just bring a friend, somebody who knows your child, because they can be very emotional and difficult. Third, it's a really good idea to develop and nurture a strong relationship with your child's teacher. This is harder when they're older and they have multiple teachers. But you want to make sure that you and the teacher are sort of on the same page as far as what you're seeing and concerns about the child. Often teachers are very quiet in these meetings. They aren't sure what they should share, what their role is. It's important for them because they're the day-to-day person who's really seeing what's going on. And it's a great way to ask someone in a meeting, does this work for you, teacher? In the real world, in the classroom, do you have the resources you need, for example, to check in with my child, when they seem to be fading away or not attending or whatever. So those are some starting points. It's never a bad idea to do things like bring bagels or something for the team, because it's just about, you want a sense of collaboration. These meetings can feel adversarial sometimes because the schools are sort of gatekeeping resources. They've got a lot of demands on them. And, and parents, we often come from the perspective of, well, I want my child to have the best of the best, which isn't what the law requires for any student with education. Unfortunately, it's about, reasonable access and support. So anything you can do. I also think it's a good idea to write your own parent report. And I really encourage people to do that. And again, there's some templates that we have, like examples of how you can do that. But again, no one knows your child like you do from the perspective you do. People will say, well, the things you're describing are educational need. And you would say, well, yes, the fact that my child's on medication and exhausted and dealing with fatigue and attentional issues and focus issues means that when they start to do homework, they're not able to manage it. There is an educational impact there, even if it's happening at home, or my child doesn't want to go to school. They're so overwhelmed and anxious and they've been through a lot of trauma. Let's not ever downplay, the impact of medical trauma on kids. And so, writing your own parent report, it also helps keep you on track. It's kind of like creating your own little parent agenda. Like, these are the things I want to make sure we talk about. You can call an IEP meeting anytime you want. And the school district, every state's a little bit different with the timelines. Here in California, it's within 30 days of your request. For some states it's 15, for some it's 45. So you can look up that information. We're sending you information about the parent centers for each state so you can get access to that. But generally, anytime you feel like you need to bring that team together and there are required team members who need to come to that meeting, you should feel free to do so, and just know that it's going to take some time for the school to get everybody together and figure out the timing and who's going to cover for the teacher and so on. So don't wait too long. It's better to have a meeting before things fall apart than after. And there are also required timelines for meetings. So anytime a child's gone through an evaluation to see if they're eligible, then an IEP team meeting happens where the team, including you as the parent, talk about those evaluations and whether or not that child meets eligibility criteria to have an IEP. In other words, be receiving special ed services. I want to say before I forget too, special education, there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. It's not a place. It's not a place where we take your child and plop them away from everybody else. The whole point of special education, and it gets lost a lot, and it's why parent advocacy is so important. The whole point is to help your child be in the most typical natural environment they would have been in if they didn't have a disability or special health care need. And so it's not a place where we send children off, even though sometimes I think it is used in that way inappropriately because a child's hard to serve, or it just seems like it might be easier. We want kids to be able to benefit from their education, from the rigorous curriculum, from the wonderful conversations that happen in the regular classroom, unless it's in the child's or student's best interest to get more specialized help. So the range is anything from, a residential treatment program 24/7 to, aid in the classroom, or just some accommodations and support and consultation to the teacher. But the goal should always be for the child to be in the most typical natural environment with their typical peers and with all those relationships. And I think for kids who've been through a lot of medical trauma and care and surgeries and all the things that our kids go through, being able to go back to your classroom, reconnect with peers, maintain, nurture relationships, that really matters to kids and it matters to families. So it's something you want to advocate for.
Great, thank you. What if, or if you start to suspect that the IEP is not being held up, what calling a meeting, so forth and so on, but what are your options? Or if you think that something is not being addressed and needs to be added, but you're getting some resistance, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, this is a common problem. I tell people you can think about special education in terms of, and this is true for 504 too, to some extent. There's two parts of it, right? One is the development of the plan, creating it. Then there's implementation. And as we all know, things, you can write a beautiful plan, but that doesn't mean that people will follow it or know how to follow it or follow it appropriately. And, our kids have subs and different teachers. And so part of how we address that is remembering that special education and an IEP are really supposed to be data driven. And data isn't just, numbers, what percentage of the spelling words did my child get right, or how much of the time are they leaving the classroom because they need a break, but also qualitative data. The child seems seems more unhappy. The child seems to be more resistant, but you want data that's not just coming from you, the parent, because frankly, I think, the schools, again, have a lot of demands on them. And they're just like, here comes another, very worried parent who wants to make sure that, we do everything. So when it comes to data for implementation, schools should keep resource logs. They call them different things, but there should be some way for you to say, can I see and make sure that my child's been getting their mental health support, their occupational therapy, their services? Because they're telling me they aren't, or I'm just not seeing progress or whatever. Schools also need to provide, and I should say all of this applies to charter schools, not just regular public schools. Charter schools are public schools, but it should also include information like progress reports. So the schools are required to give you an update about how your child's progressing toward their IEP goals, which are, those individualized goals that we've created for the child to figure out where are they now and where do we want them to be in a year. And so taking a good look at those progress reports to see, are they actually based on data? Is there work? Is there evidence? Can you say, can I see the spelling test? Can I see the artwork? Can I see, the group project? How much did my child participate in that? Do you have any data on that? So first of all, trying to take your emotions out of it, which is super hard, and think about, if I couldn't say a word, what could I show this team to help them understand my concerns? If you get the resource logs, and you see that services aren't being provided, and this is a common problem. We have a terrible teacher shortage and provider shortage right now across the country. So, just really important to know that you can, write to your special education administrator, and not just your case manager at the school, but the big person kahuna who's over everybody for special education, and say, it's come to my attention. I'm not sure why this is happening. I need a better understanding, but also what are we going to do to make up the services for my child? Because you are entitled, or your child is entitled to get those services made up for. Calling an IEP meeting, which you can do, as I said, anytime, and do everything in writing. This is a process where staff changes, schools change, things get lost, people get overwhelmed, or sometimes just too busy and miss it. And so you want to put everything in writing. So requesting an IEP meeting, bringing that team together, realizing you are a part of it, and probably the most important member, because a teacher, excuse me, or an educator is going to help your child for a year, But as a parent, I tell people we're the ones who sit on our child's bed at the end of the day when they're asleep and worry about 10 years from now. That's our perspective. And the school's perspective is, how do we make sure the kid gets through this year, learns some of the basic stuff we want to make sure that they learn. And it's not that they don't care, but they care in a different way and they don't have the long view. So as a parent, that's what you're holding, is the long view. This is what I've seen. This is what I'm worried about. Here's some examples specifically. And then also try to always come into the meeting with a focus on what you want to see done in a positive way rather than just what's wrong. Because I think that's a mistake we often make, and educators, especially in special education, I think they often feel kind of beat up. And so being able to say, I understand that my child hasn't been getting the specialized instruction that they need to help them with their math skills or with their behavior or with their mental health. I'm wondering if we should talk about whether they need more support in the form of an aide or a paraeducator, or an increase in services. What do people think about that? Because, this isn't working. So that you have proposed solutions or at least ideas, rather than you just come into the meeting and tell them how they're screwing up, which, that's a hard one for people. And then I guess I would just say that if you have a meeting and you feel that you weren't able to participate in that meeting effectively or in a meaningful way, that your concerns weren't addressed or whatever, you can always follow up after the meeting, again, to the special education director usually, and raise your concerns and say, I was concerned, I think we might need another meeting, or I want to just meet with you. And there are all kinds of rights there's a fancy word, we call them procedural safeguards, but basically there's specific legal steps you can take when you're in disagreement with the school. And you can be in disagreement with the school over what they're proposing to do or not do, but also you can make complaints if they know they should do it and they're not doing it. That's a different process. And of course, if you feel like your child's being discriminated against, so for example, gee, your child's just a little medically fragile right now, and we're doing this camping trip, and all the fourth graders are doing it, but unless you can come, we just don't think it will be appropriate. Well, that's a real problem because that's discrimination. As a parent, of course, you may decide whether it's appropriate or not for your child to go. But if you think my child could go with the right support, that's a discrimination issue. If they're saying, because of your child's disability or special health care need, they won't be able to come because we don't have the staffing, they need to get the staffing. So those three areas, are they complying with the law, following the law? Are they discriminating against a student, even unintentionally? Or is there really just a fundamental disagreement about what you think the child, kind of help they need and what they're getting? There are ways to address each of those. And again, we'll put some of that information in our resources.
It's really interesting what you say about when you brought that example up of like a field trip, because I think a lot of our families experience that, where especially because our children have to carry special medications like stress dose steroids in case of emergency, those types of things. They have fluid imbalance issues that have to be monitored. And I think sometimes our parents get pushback at the get-go about those things because it's a rare condition, and so there's a little bit of trepidation about giving those medications. But I've also heard, they can't go on a field trip without you going, or that kind of thing. So it's really interesting to know that that's actually not how it should be.
No, I mean, you can't take your, this is what I tell educators. And by the way, I have a family full of them. So we have some interesting conversations at home, but you can't put your hand out for federal and public money, tax money, and then say, but we don't have, but your child can't come on an activity that everybody else gets to go to because we don't have the resources. So that is sort of the heart of discrimination, because of your disability. And when we say disability, we're referring very broadly to, an impairment of a major life function. So, it may be a medically diagnosed disability. It may be something that was found through a special education evaluation, but we use the word disability because that's where all the rights and the laws are. But yeah, it's super important. And I think part of how especially around mental health needs, I see this, but and healthcare needs, diabetes and so on too. There are very important protections. The school really is on the hook. If they're going to offer it for anybody, they have to offer it for everybody. But getting ahead of that. So at the beginning of the year, when they say, by the way, we're all going to do an outdoor environmental education camp for 3 days in March, we'll be giving you more information right out of the chutes. You probably want to say, just want to, figure out, how we're going to work together to make sure that my child has access to all of those activities as well.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about like some other, creative or different accommodations that might be needed. Particularly like many of our patients and survivors have really big fatigue issues, that kind of thing, and require a shortened school day. If that's a requirement or that's a necessary accommodation, I've seen situations where they've gotten pushback on that. What is the best course of action?
Yeah, I think there's a very common misconception that you're either attending, in person or you're not, and that there's, nothing in between. And remember that there's an I in IEP, which means individualized. And so if the student needs that kind of individualization, the team needs to try to work together to figure it out. But it's hard. I know, I was just talking to a parent the other day whose child has chronic migraine. And, there are days the child can go to school and do fine. And there are days when that child cannot go to school. So there are creative solutions. And I think step one always is to, listen and say to the school, like, what are you seeing? After lunch, what my child's telling me is that basically they're done. They don't have the stamina, the energy, and it used to be in the olden days, because I, been around a while, that we always had like a nurse's office. Remember that? Where kids could go and lay down and even take a rest. And, most schools now these days don't have that. So I think the first thing is to call a meeting and get everybody together and just say, we need to talk about this. And often when a child's first coming back to school, it's helpful to create something called a reintegration plan, where maybe they are coming back slowly, and then we're going to monitor how they're doing and over time. Again, getting, as the parent, you end up holding the healthcare and the educational systems, two huge administratively complex bureaucratic systems. But getting your healthcare providers to document the need is really, really important. I tell people, try not to say, I feel that my child needs a shortened school day. That's your feeling. But when you say, I've got a letter here from their physician or from their, social worker, healthcare team, and that at this time they need a reduced schedule, that's much more powerful. It's very hard for the school to argue with the physician's recommendation. Sometimes and we learned this during COVID, right? It is possible to do distance education, but it still feels very much like, for most schools across the country, there's this idea that it's either or. And I think that's going to change over time, is my sense, because people are starting to realize, wait a minute, this is a great tool in our toolkit to allow a child to participate from home. We have people appearing in, meetings at the White House as robots from their home with their face on the video. The world is changing. And so, I think that's a big issue, especially when parents are trying to make sure the child stays on track to graduate, to go to college. And then, you have an older child who's not earning their credit. So what can we do? And I think putting the impetus back on the school team too, which is, so you're telling me that you can't do a hybrid of sometimes in person and sometimes at home, and that my only option is, home hospital, for example, which generally, is a very limited program. But my child's goal is to graduate, and special education is supposed to prepare students for future employment, education, and independent living. So we're not. So, sometimes it's a question of they need to reduce schedule, but they will have an additional year or two to finish their degree. And sometimes it's a question of, there will be some credit recovery or whatever in the summer, maybe through a distance learning plan. But just know that it is your child's right to be in an appropriate, not the best of the best, but an appropriate setting. And if their healthcare is such that they really need the options for reduced time, they should get them. I always tell parents, think about IEP goals as a thing that's guiding you, because if the goal is a year from now, my child will be able to participate all day, but right now, an hour and they're done, then you can say, you know, let's write a goal to sort of carefully build their stamina up, and teach them like where they can go to take a break or a rest or whatever, and when do they need to go home, what are the signs in their body that, you know, they've reached that point. And all of that is really important in making sure that the plan is really individualized.
So you had mentioned you were talking kind of about diploma and college and that kind of thing. So that kind of segues into when it might be appropriate not to consider pursuing a diploma or coming off that diploma track. I know that definitely can come with some emotion and you know, that kind of thing. But I'd love to hear about that. You know, when would that be considered and when would that be beneficial?
Right. Let me back up just a minute and say that in order to answer that question, it's really important to understand the difference between accommodations and modifications. So accommodations are the things we do. You get accommodations even in college, right? In order to make sure that the student has equal access. So if they need a note taker, or they need to use the computer for all their assignments, or they need extra time for their SAT or for their tests in chemistry or whatever, or a quiet place. Those are accommodations. They aren't fundamentally changing what the child's learning. They're just creating different ways for the child to learn it or for them to show what they learned. So for example, giving a verbal presentation instead of typing a paper, that kind of thing. So they still have to show that they understood the book and they can give examples and so on. Modifications are different. And for a lot of kids who've been through the kind of treatment and side effects and, you know, effects of the cancer itself, this can become an issue, because a modification is, we're not expecting that the student is taking pre-calc. It's just too much that, you know, pre-calculus or a high level math class or whatever. But we still want them to be at their general education high school and have math. And so we're going to modify the curriculum for them, meaning they're not expected to learn as the state standard requires or anything like that, but we're going to, you know, have them working on math during that period. So it might be that it's fourth grade math, and that's okay. So if you get to that point where you feel like, you know, my child, you know, accommodations aren't going to be really enough, and even if we gave some special education support around a learning disability or attentional issues or whatever, they just are not going to be able to grasp these concepts anytime soon. Then it's time to have a conversation with the IEP team and bring that team together to discuss. And that you don't need to make this decision really until high school, because, you know, that's the other thing about our kids, and especially kids who are dealing with, you know, long-term chronic conditions. We don't know where they're going to be in a year, 2 years, or 3 years. So we always have to have a plan A, a plan B, maybe a plan C. But by the time they're entering their freshman year, you know, it may be very clear that the impact of everything they've gone through is such that, you know, they can't access just through accommodations anymore. They really need a modified curriculum. And at that point, it may make more sense to just provide them with support that's appropriate to their needs. IDEA, again, the special education law, it's Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And notice that I say it's not the Individuals with Disabilities Academic Act, because it's also, you know, our kids need to be learning things that are, you know, help them transition into adulthood and how to work in a group and all of that. So it's not just about how a child's doing academically. So calling an IEP meeting and saying, you know, really want to, my number one goal as a parent is to make sure that my child is happy, engaged, and learning. And whether they're learning at the same pace as everybody else is not the big priority here. I want them to be learning and making progress, but I don't want them to be in a pressure cooker. I don't want them, I don't think it's a reasonable thing for them to be required to take all these classes. So in most states, you can still get a diploma, but it's kind of an alternative diploma where you're working toward more of a long-term preparation for adulthood plan. And IDEA, the special ed law, requires that students who have not earned a regular high school diploma can continue to receive services until they're 22. Every state has some slightly different rules about when you count the 22. So, we'll include some information about that. But basically, by no later than their 22nd birthday or the semester where their 22nd birthday happens, then they aren't eligible for special education services anymore. So lots of students, number one, who do want to get a high school diploma but need everything slowed way down, should be able to keep working toward a diploma. They might need 2 or 3 years to pass Algebra 1. And that should be a conversation that the special education team is willing to have. Or they might need special education math, where they're not learning algebra per se, but they are learning some basic functional life skills math. So bring the team together, talk about it, monitor it. If the child starts to do better, or your priorities change. If you think your child absolutely should be on diploma track and then they're in their junior year and you're like, wait a minute, we're not going to be ready to exit the services in 2 years, that does not seem appropriate. That's something to bring to the team. And sometimes, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but sometimes parents tell us that they feel like the school is just passing their child along because they want to, stop serving them. It's like, oh, don't worry, we'll just give her the diploma. I know we had a situation like that here at Dredif this year, where someone called us and the child had a very significant medical issue in the fall. And as a result of that, had very different cognitive functioning than they did before they had that incident. And the school was still trying to graduate this student, even though this student really was working more at a 7 or 8 year old level now because of the incident. So in those sorts of situations, I think it's really important to know that you have that option to stay in the system, work on transition goals, work on things like navigating the local community, living independently, and so on, and not working just on the academics.
Just a couple of more final questions or discussion points on IEP meetings and IEPs. Can you have an IEP meeting recorded? A lot of times it's very overwhelming. You walk out and you're sort of not exactly sure what just happened. So is it reasonable to ask for a recording of it? And when you receive the IEP, what should you look for? When should you sign it, et cetera?
Great. Yeah, good final questions. I think, first of all, let me emphasize again and again, you're a part of the IEP team. You're not a guest. And so some states require a parent signature every single time. California is one of those. Some states make you sign the first time and then your signature is not required. But if you don't agree with the plan, you have to take next steps. But what's important to know, what you said is so true. These meetings you're getting a ton of information. You might be sitting there as the parent or even the youth, and you have 6, 7, 8 experts around the table using vocabulary and language that you may not know and giving you information you may or may not even agree with. And so knowing that you have the right to record the meeting is important. Now, every state seems to interpret this differently. Here in California, you give 5 days. You give 24 hours notice that you intend to record the meeting, and then you are able to record it. And a lot of states have similar rules, but there are other states, I know Florida, for example, where the whole team has to agree that they're willing to be recorded. So check with your local parent training information center. But if you are told that they're not going to let you record the meeting, then make sure that you say, then let's make sure we extend the time for this meeting. I need to be able to answer my questions. I need to be able to share information, or maybe we need a part 2 or whatever. But generally, you can record the meeting, but check for your state's specific requirements. As far as signing the IEP too, I just want to say, you don't have to feel like you have to agree at the meeting. You have a lot to think about and process. You have a right to get the copy of the proposed document with the new goals for the child and what services they're going to get. And you have 3 choices. You can say, I agree with this plan. Looks good to me. Let's try it. But, hey, let's have an IEP meeting after a few months. Let's not wait for a whole year, which is the minimum requirement. Every year the team has to meet just to check in. Or you can say, gosh, I agree with some parts of this plan, but not others. I think my child needs a paraeducator. I think my child needs to check in with a counselor once a week. I think they need physical therapy. And then the third option is to say, I don't agree with this plan and I reject it. So you can have your child evaluated for special ed. And then if the plan they're proposing you feel like would do more harm than good, you're the parent. You can say, no, thank you. I think maybe we should go back to a 504 plan or try a 504 plan. All of those options are there. Parents are frequently told, well, you need to sign the IEP or you need to agree to the IEP. Don't feel pressured. Take the time you need to understand it. Check with you guys, check with your parent training and information center for your state, talk with friends, other people I imagine in your community there's a lot of people who've been through it a little bit longer who can be resources and mentors. But I would just end with this. If that little tiny parent radar of yours tells you that there's something you just aren't agreeing with, or you need more information, or you need the IEP translated because English wasn't your first language and you want to make sure you really get it, it's a legal binding document. Don't sign it until you get the answers that you need. Because in the end, like I've said repeatedly, you are the decision maker and that child. And so don't feel pressured into it, but don't wait too long, because until you sign it, they also don't have to provide the services. So just sitting on it for months is also a problem.
Such great information. I mean, we could go deeper and probably will in time. There's so much to talk about around this subject. Thank you, Cheryl, so much for your insights and expertise. And we will include resources and links to things that you referenced. So thanks again for joining us today.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. And again, thank you guys for the work you do. It's so important.
Thanks.